The pen was already in his hand. Dale Hargrove stood in the middle of the Westfield John Deere dealership in Grundy County, Illinois, and the fluorescent lights overhead made everything look clean and new and inevitable. The 4440 sat on the showroom floor 30 feet away, green and yellow under the lights, 130 horsepower power shift transmission, and 8-row planter package included if he signed today. Tom Aldrich, the sales manager, was talking again. Something about depreciation schedules and fall delivery windows. But Dale wasn't listening. He was looking at the contract. The financing rate was 5%. The monthly payment would run $1,840 for 7 years. Aldrich had walked him through the math 3 times, each time emphasizing not what this machine would cost, but what it would earn. Greater efficiency, more acres per hour, the ability to plant 400 acres in 3 days instead of 5. That's 2 days back in your pocket every spring, Aldrich had said, smiling. 2 days you could be doing something else. Dale had nodded. It sounded reasonable. In March of 1979, most things sounded reasonable. Commodity prices had been climbing for 2 solid years. Corn was trading above $2, $70. Soybeans had touched $7, $50 the previous fall, and the projections coming out of the Chicago Board of Trade showed no reason for alarm. Carter's grain embargo against the Soviet Union was still a year away. Credit was available. The government was signaling support for agriculture, and every farmer in the county seemed to be either buying land or buying equipment, or doing both simultaneously. The culture of 1979 rural Illinois had a single operating thesis. Now is the time to grow. Aldrich set a fresh copy of the contract on the hood of the 4440. "You're not buying a tractor, Dale," he said. "You're buying capacity." He said it the way a doctor explains a necessary surgery. Not a choice, really, but a professional obligation. The guys who don't upgrade now are going to be playing catch-up for a decade. Dale picked up the pen, and then he thought about the ledger. It wasn't sentiment that stopped him. Dale Hargrove was not a sentimental man. His father, Gerald Hargrove, had died 4 years earlier at 68 after farming 320 acres of black Grundy County silt loam for 40 years. He'd left Dale the land, the equipment, a manageable operating loan, and a gray metal filing cabinet in the back room of the farmhouse office. Inside that cabinet, in a manila folder labeled simply Accounts, was a handwritten ledger going back to 1951. Every year, every input cost, every yield, every price received, every loan payment made. Dale had read it cover to cover the week after the funeral, not out of grief, out of information management. He needed to understand what he'd inherited beyond the physical assets. What he found in those pages was not a sentimental document. It was something closer to a financial autobiography. Gerald Hargrove had lived through the price spike of 1947 and its collapse. He'd watched neighbors expand in the early 1950s when prices were favorable, and he'd recorded in terse, penciled shorthand what happened to those neighbors when prices fell and interest accrued. One entry, from 1954, read simply, "Kowalczyk sold North 80, couldn't make interest." Another from 1958, Bremer auction, good equipment, poor timing. Gerald never editorialized, he just wrote what happened. Standing in the dealership, Dale tried to do the math on the 4440 the way his father would have. Not Aldrich's math, not the optimistic math of higher capacity and recovered planting days, but the baseline math. What does this payment look like if corn drops to $2.10? What does it look like at $1? 90? What does it look like if I have a drought year and yields come in at 80 bushels instead of 130? The answers were uncomfortable. At $1.90, corn and 80 bushel yields on his best 200 acres. The payment consumed his entire operating margin and then some. He'd be liquidating savings to meet it. "Tom," Dale said, setting the pen down on the contract, "I need to take this home." The silence in the showroom lasted about 2 seconds. Aldrich's expression didn't break. He was too professional for that. But something behind his eyes shifted. "The fall delivery pricing ends Friday," Aldrich said. "After that, we're looking at spring pricing, and availability gets tighter." "I understand," Dale said. He drove home in his 1974 Ford pickup with the heater rattling and the contract folded in his front pocket. That night, he pulled the ledger out of the filing cabinet and opened it to 1952. He wasn't looking for inspiration. He was looking for a pattern. What Gerald Hargrove had documented across nearly 3 decades was a recurring structure. Prices rise. Credit loosens. Neighbors expand. Prices fall, not always dramatically, sometimes gradually, but inexorably. Credit tightens. The people who expanded on borrowed money during the upswing face a mathematical reality during the downswing that no amount of efficiency can solve: fixed payments against declining revenue. That wasn't the real risk, Dale realized. The real risk wasn't buying a tractor. It was the structure of the purchase, debt service that didn't flex with commodity prices layered on top of existing obligations, in a moment when everyone around him believed prices would hold. He'd seen this movie before. Not personally, but in his father's handwriting. The 4440 was a good machine. Dale didn't doubt that. It would genuinely plant more acres per hour, genuinely save time in the spring window, genuinely improve operational capacity. But that wasn't the real risk. It wasn't about the machine. It was about leverage. At $1,140 per month against an income stream tied to commodity prices, he was building a fixed cost into a variable revenue model. And the variable side of that equation had a history his father had documented in pencil across 30 years. He called Aldrich the next morning and declined. The reaction in Grundy County was not dramatic. Nobody organized a protest or staged an intervention. But farmers talk, and by April, word had moved through the coffee shops and the elevator and the co-op that Dale Hargrove had passed on the new 4440. He was still running his father's 1968 4020. He was, by the consensus of the township, behind. His neighbor Gary Wellman had signed the same week Dale walked out. Gary farmed 480 acres 2 miles to the east, a good operator, methodical, not a gambler by nature. But Gary had also been looking at the same commodity prices Dale had been looking at, and he had 2 teenage sons who wanted to farm, and the logic of expansion made sense in a world where grain prices appeared structurally elevated. Gary's payment was $2,100 per month. He signed with confidence. That spring planting season went smoothly for everyone. Corn went in on time. The weather cooperated. Gary's 44-440 covered his ground in 3 days, just as Aldrich had promised. Dale's 40-20 took 5. Gary mentioned this at the elevator in June, not unkindly, just observationally. "You'd have had 2 more days," he said. Dale nodded. "I would have," he agreed. Through the summer of 1979, grain prices stayed firm. Dale questioned himself quietly, in the way that financially disciplined people always do, when the thing they said no to appears to be working for everyone who said yes. Maybe Aldrich had been right. Maybe the expansion thesis was correct. Maybe his father's ledger reflected a different era, different economics. A world before government price supports and export demand had changed the fundamental calculus of American grain farming. Then, in January 1980, Jimmy Carter announced the grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The embargo didn't crash prices overnight. That's not how these things work, and if you were watching closely, the real damage came from a different direction. In October 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker had announced a shift in monetary policy. The Fed was going to break inflation by restricting money supply. interest rates were going up, not a little. The prime rate, which had been around 11% when Dale had been sitting in Aldrich's showroom, was moving toward 15%, then 18%. By mid-1980, the prime rate hit 21. 5%. Read that number again, 21.5%, for farmers who'd borrowed at variable rates, and many had because variable rates had been lower at signing. This wasn't an inconvenience. It was a structural disaster. A $200,000 operating loan that had carried 10% interest suddenly carried 18%, then 21%. The annual interest cost on that loan went from $20,000 to $42,000 in less than 18 months. The math stopped working, not in a manageable way, not in a tighten-your-belt way. In a fundamental, the payments now exceed the income way. Gary Wellman's equipment financing had been at a fixed rate, so the tractor payment held. But Gary had also refinanced his operating loan in 1979 to expand his seed and fertilizer purchases, expecting strong yields to cover it. That loan was variable. By the spring of 1981, his interest expense had increased by nearly $14,000 annually against corn prices that had dropped from $2.70 to around $2. 35 after the embargo disrupted export expectations. Gary didn't say much about it, but Dale noticed he was spending more time at the elevator talking to the lender's ag representative, and those conversations had the quiet urgency of renegotiation. Dale's picture was different. He had no equipment debt. His operating loan was modest: seed, fertilizer, diesel, and he'd kept it flat rather than expanding it. When rates spiked, his interest exposure was limited. He felt the increase. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't existential. By 1982, the pattern his father had documented in that ledger was running in real time. Commodity prices had weakened. Land values, which had inflated dramatically through the late 1970s as farmers leveraged rising equity to borrow more, were beginning to soften. The farmers who'd bought land at $2,000 or $20,500 per acre in 1978 and 1979, borrowing against projected commodity returns that assumed $2. $50 corn were watching their collateral erode as prices fell and appraisals followed. The Westfield John Deere dealership's lot, which had been almost empty in 1979, equipment moving so fast it barely touched the ground, was now filling up. Repossessed inventory, equipment that farmers couldn't make payments on, reclaimed by the lender and returned to the dealer. A green 4240, a row of planters, a nearly new grain cart. Dale drove past the lot every time he went into town. He counted the machines. By spring of 1983, there were 11 pieces of equipment sitting on that lot that had come back from farms within 30 miles. Aldrich was still there, still professional, still composed. But the dealership had stopped hosting Saturday morning customer appreciation breakfasts. The sign in the window advertising zero-down financing had been taken down. Dale asked him about it once, briefly, at the parts counter. Tom shrugged and said, "It's a tough market." Dale bought his parts and left. There was nothing to add. The foreclosure that shocked the community was the Breckenridge place. Harold Breckenridge had farmed 640 acres north of town, third generation. His grandfather had broken that ground. He'd expanded in 1978 and 1979, buying 160 acres at $2,200 per acre, financing it at terms that required strong corn prices to service. By 1983, corn was below $2.00 in the fall market, his operating costs had risen with inflation, and the bank, under pressure from federal regulators to clean up agricultural portfolios, declined to extend his operating line. The auction was on a Wednesday in March 1984. Cold morning. Dale went not to gloat. He couldn't have explained exactly why he went, except that some accounting required witnessing. Harold stood near the fence and watched his equipment sell. His face was neutral in the way faces go neutral when there's nothing left to express. A 7820 tractor went for 60 cents on the dollar. A grain dryer went for less. The land itself was scheduled to sell separately. Dale didn't bid on anything that day. He wasn't ready, but he watched the prices. He was doing math. The summer of 1984 was when the power started to shift, quietly and without ceremony. A 160-acre parcel 2 miles from Dale's home place came up for sale, not at auction, but through a private arrangement between a bank and a neighboring farmer who could no longer carry the debt. The bank's ag lender called Dale because he had a known reputation: no equipment debt, modest operating line, solid yield history. They wanted a buyer who could close without additional financing contingencies. The price was $1,400 per acre. 3 years earlier, that ground had been appraised at $2,100. Dale had been accumulating cash quietly since 1979. Not a fortune. 5 years of modest profits on 320 acres doesn't build a fortune, but enough of a cushion that when the opportunity arrived, he could act. He put $80,000 down and financed the remainder at a negotiated fixed rate. His payment was manageable against any reasonable corn price scenario. He ran the math 6 ways before he signed, and every version of the math worked. He farmed that ground for the first time in the fall of 1984. It was good dirt. It had always been good dirt. It had just been carrying the wrong capital structure. By 1986, the farm crisis had a name. Congress was holding hearings. Farm aid concerts were raising money and awareness. The statistics were becoming visible in ways that abstract financial pressure never quite manages. 235,000 farms had failed or significantly restructured between 1981 and 1986. In some Midwest counties, more than 10% of farms changed hands under financial duress. Land values had dropped 50% to 60% from their 1981 peaks in parts of Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota. Gary Wellman survived, barely and not without significant restructuring. He sold the 4440 in 1984, not repossessed, but sold voluntarily to reduce debt, and went back to leasing equipment for 2 seasons while he rebuilt his operating line. He never said much to Dale about what those years cost him. Dale never asked. Gary was a good farmer and a decent man, and the decisions he'd made in 1979 had made sense in 1979. The environment had changed in ways that were genuinely difficult to anticipate from inside the optimism of that moment. That's worth saying clearly. The farmers who borrowed and expanded in 1979 were not reckless people. They were responding rationally to the signals the market was sending. The dealer wasn't lying about efficiency. The tractor was real. The yield math was real. The capacity improvements were real. What the dealer couldn't model, what nobody in that showroom in 1979 could model with certainty, was a 21% prime rate, a grain embargo, and a simultaneous collapse in land values that erased the collateral supporting all that debt. These things weren't inevitable. They were possible. And that's the distinction Gerald Hargrove had spent 30 years writing down in pencil. Not that expansion is bad, not that debt is always destructive, but that borrowed optimism, financing growth on the assumption that favorable conditions persist, carries a risk that doesn't show up on the dealership's efficiency calculator. It shows up later, in the gap between fixed payments and variable revenue, when the gap opens wider than you planned for and stays open longer than you can sustain. In the spring of 1987, Dale Hargrove was farming 480 acres. He'd acquired 2 additional parcels since 1984, one at auction, one through a private bank sale, both at prices that would have seemed impossible in 1979. His equipment was aging but functional and debt-free. His operating line was modest. He'd added a small grain storage system for cash, not because he'd planned it, but because a neighbor's bins had come available at a distress sale and the math supported it. The Westfield John Deere dealership had changed hands. in 1986. The new owners were consolidating inventory, closing satellite locations, restructuring the business for a market that had permanently contracted in the short term. Aldrich had moved on. Dale had heard he was in insurance now, which seemed like the kind of lateral move that a market correction produces. One evening in April, Dale sat at the kitchen table with his father's ledger open in front of him. He'd been thinking about this moment for a while, without quite planning it. He opened to the back the blank pages that Gerald had never filled, and he wrote the first entry in his own hand. 1979, declined 4440 upgrade, Westfield JD, financing at 11, 5%, 1,840 hours month. Reviewed ledger, decision, hold. Then, page by page, he wrote through what had followed. Not every detail, but the structure, the rate spike, the neighbors' restructuring, the Breckenridge auction, the land acquisitions, the years of operating with margin instead of payment pressure. He wrote it the way his father had written it. Without editorializing, without vindication, without drama. Just the record. He wrote the final entry for 1987, 480 acres, no equipment debt, operating line $42,000, 2 parcels acquired at distressed prices, 1984 to 1986, soil in good condition, working the rotation. Then he closed the ledger and set it back in the gray metal filing cabinet. He didn't feel like he'd won something. He felt like he'd finished a sentence his father had started. The question this story keeps circling back to is not whether the 4440 was a good machine. It was. The question is what efficiency actually means when it's financed with debt in a volatile market. Efficiency improves output per hour. Debt creates fixed obligations that don't move with commodity prices. When markets are rising, the efficiency argument wins. When markets fall, and they always fall eventually for reasons that are genuinely difficult to predict, the fixed obligations remain. That's the asymmetry that the ledger had been documenting since 1951. Would you have signed that contract in 1979? Most people, looking at the same data Dale was looking at in that showroom, would have. The prices were real. The credit was available. The cultural pressure was real. The dealer wasn't wrong about efficiency. The conditions that made the decision dangerous weren't visible yet. They became visible later, in the form of a 21% prime rate and a grain embargo nobody had fully priced in. The lesson isn't contrarianism. It's not that you should always refuse to borrow or always distrust expansion. The lesson is what the ledger represented. Accumulated memory of how economic cycles actually behave, as opposed to how they appear to behave when you're standing inside a favorable one. Gerald Hargrove hadn't predicted the farm crisis. He'd just documented enough cycles that his son understood, viscerally, numerically, that favorable conditions are temporary and fixed costs are not. That gap, between the permanence of debt and the impermanence of favorable prices, is where farm crises live. Dale Hargrove had read about it in pencil. When the moment came, he remembered. If this story resonates with you, if you know someone who made a disciplined call in a moment of widespread optimism and watched it play out exactly the way they'd figured, leave their name in the comments. These decisions rarely make the news. They don't have ribbon cuttings or press releases. They show up later, quietly, in the form of land still owned and debt not carried, and operations still running when others have been absorbed or sold. And if you want more stories about the economic decisions that shaped rural America, the ones made at kitchen tables with ledgers and pencils rather than at closing tables with lawyers, subscribe. They're worth knowing about. All events and economic conditions referenced are consistent with documented agricultural and macroeconomic data from the 1979-1987 farm crisis period. The prime rate reached 21.5% in December 1980. U.S. farmland values declined an average of 40-60% from their 1981 peak in key Midwest states by 1986. Approximately 235,000 farms were lost to foreclosure or financial restructuring during this period.